What do we do?
Tonight,
there's a certain palatable blackness that is accepted by society.
A closer look at the state of race in America.
I think it always feels like it's a boiling point.
The line between free speech and hate speech in question.
I feel like every day you have to watch your words.
Communities grappling with inequality from policing to housing.
I have nowhere else to go.
But today, more people are also building bridges and setting examples.
I think the racial healing starts with communication.
Focusing on our common humanity.
I'm proud to say that I have friends that are different than me.
So how can we create a more equitable world? And how do we create the space to have those tough conversations?
I think it's up to us.
From NBC News, a special presentation, the National Day of Racial Healing, sponsored by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Here now are Kate Snow and Sinclair Asamoah.
Welcome, everyone.
We are so very glad that you're here with us.
The National Day of Racial Healing was created 7 years ago by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. It takes place on the day after Martin Luther King Day to celebrate our differences and draw meaningful connections for positive change.
And since we're talking about racial healing, let's spend a moment on the word race. The reality is, many scientists agree that race itself has no biological significance. We're all the same in our humanity. Rather, it's a social construct, one with some very real implications.
Yeah, together, Zinkle and I anchor NBC News Daily every weekday in New York, usually. But today, we are at Universal City in Los Angeles County. The land where we are meeting has been a gathering place and trading center for people of different backgrounds and cultures.
Earlier, we observed a land acknowledgement and blessing. The practice of land acknowledgements is a way to acknowledge and honor indigenous peoples who have long called this land home.
Right now, we are meeting in the round in an effort to learn from the indigenous practice of healing circles. When it comes to racial healing in the United States, there, of course, has been pain, loss, injustice, and inequity. From this program, we hope to equip you with tools to navigate tough and at times uncomfortable conversations, and we'll show you stories that we hope inspire and cultivate better understanding.
But let's start with a look at why we're hosting this special right here in Los Angeles. It's a place rich in history and diversity, and it's also no stranger to racial tensions. But as NBC News Now anchor Vicki Wynn shows us, during challenging times, there are often people trying to bring light.
Los Angeles, a city known for its cultural vibrancy and ethnic diversity, but also deeply rooted here, simmering racial tensions that sometimes boil over. Like in this leaked audio recording of several LA City Council members making racist remarks.
And then there's the white guy with the little black kid who's misbehaved.
And we've seen racial disharmony play out all across the country.
Anger in the streets across America. Massive crowds gathering again to protest the death of George Floyd.
After Black Lives Matter protests erupted over the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and a rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, culminating in a shooting rampage at several Atlanta area spas, killing 8 people, 6 of them Asian. According to the FBI, hate crimes reported in the U.S. have been steadily increasing for years. They're at their highest level since data collection began in 1991. And in Los Angeles, things are no different. A recent survey found that less than 10% of residents feel that racial groups in the city get along. A pessimistic view that may not be surprising given the city's history. From the Zoot Suit riots in 1943 that targeted Mexican Americans for wearing clothing considered unpatriotic, to the Watts riots in 1965 that ignited after an African American man, Marquette Fry, was pulled over for driving drunk and beaten. Then, 1992, when demonstrators set the city ablaze after 4 Los Angeles police officers were acquitted in the beating of Rodney King. But there are those who are working hard towards change and hoping to correct past wrongs.
This is the site of one of America's great mistakes.
a racetrack that served as an assembly center for Japanese Americans during World War II. It was that wrongful imprisonment of more than 100,000 people that prompted some activists to campaign for reparations and an official apology from the government.
Mia Iwataki was one of those activists.
Historically, California was ground zero for anti-Japanese hate and anti-Asian legislation.
She was part of a coalition that helped win passage of the Civil Liberties Act in 1988, which granted reparations to Japanese Americans who had been wrongly interned by the U.S. government.
How did that feel for you, that moment, when you won the reparations?
It was such a powerful moment. It changed my life. It put a human face on the concentration camp experience for this country and for the world.
Did it help your generation feel seen?
Yes.
Now, 35 years later, she and other advocates are demanding reparations for others, working alongside blacks and Latinos to fight for social justice and equality.
Well, my hope is the type of solidarity work that we're doing spreads out during these times. I think it's up to us.
Working in solidarity and across cultures to bring healing to communities that need it most.
NBC's Vicki Nguyen reporting there. We're joined now by California Democratic Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She has proposed legislation to create the first National Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Also with us, Jerry Teo. He's a racial healing practitioner and founder of the National Compadres Network. Welcome to you both. Thank you both for being here with us.
Very happy to be here.
I was struck that you both grew up in California. You both took part and witnessed the civil rights movement here. I want to start with your thoughts about where we are right now when it comes to race relations in America. I'll start with you, Congresswoman.
Well, thank you so much. This is such an important day. Where we are with regard to race relations is, I think we're right at an inflection point. We can either go forward and really tell the truth about all of our histories, or we can go backwards as some are trying to take us. And I think what is so important right now, and why I introduced the resolution to establish truth, racial healing, and transformation, is because, for instance, as it relates to those who are descendants of the Middle Passage, African Americans who were enslaved for over 250 years, we have to tell the truth before we can move on to really bring the country together. And so many people don't know the truth about what took place. And so healing is extremely important, but I don't think we can get there until we have these activities, these forums, a national day and a national strategy for truth, racial healing, and transformation.
Mr. Teo, what's your perspective on that same question? Where are we right now?
Well, it really takes me back because my family is Native and Mexican, but I grew up in Compton. I'm straight out of Compton. I grew up in a black-brown neighborhood, and the neighborhood I grew up in was Mexicano along with African-American. And we lived together, we played together, went to school together, we did things together, and I remember a time when we as neighbors would take care of each other. When my grandmother would bless Tyrone, and I go to Tyrone's, and he'd bless me up too, and we'd take care of each other. But but at the same time, we experienced and saw, really the implications of racism. I was in high school when we called them the blowouts, the Watts blowouts happened, and there was National Guard on the corner of my house, right? And when me and my African American friends were walking to school, National Guard with AK-47, cocking those guns, and it tightened us up, and it reminded me of all the fear that we had throughout the years of just trying to live, just trying to be, remembering the words, the ugly words that were said about my grandmother, about Tyrone's mom, about seeing cops, pull Tyrone's father on the front of the lawn with 4 cop cars and us coming home and us being afraid, him being my best friend, crying, me trying to protect him. So I was of a time where we were together but struggling, and all that trauma stays in us. Yeah. All that trauma is about why we need racial healing, but all that experience is why I do this work today.
You have done this work of racial healing for over 40 years, and I understand you're very well read into healing circles. In fact, you facilitate many of them. Would you mind just grounding us in this conversation this hour, leading us in one of those?
Sure. I mean, You know, I would just like to invite us all to take a deep breath. So all just take a deep breath, because the sacredness of our breath is how we came into this world. Our mothers brought us into this world with a dream, with a dream that, and as you take this breath, I want you to imagine your ancestors and your mother's dream, that you would be honored, that you would be respected, that you would be heard, that you would be seen, and that you would be loved in a good way. And as we do that, we vision that this is a world that can be. But we also, at the same time, vision the work that we need to do to get us there. So when we do racial healing circles, we always begin with a vision. And we always have the intention of moving forward, but telling truth along the way of acknowledging the work that we have to do.
Well, we've got a lot of questions for you, but so does our studio audience. So I do want to turn to our NBC News correspondent, Guad Venegas, who's going to be with us this hour and has one audience question. Guad, what you got?
Sinclair, Kate, we have our first question of the evening. For that, I am joined by Jay Stewart. He is a Chief of Strategy and Innovation at Alliance College Ready Public Schools, and he has a question for Congresswoman Barbara Lee. What's your question?
Excellent. First of all, the best public school in the country, Alliance. So young people are watching. We have a lot of political division in the country that's leveraging politics around racial division. And I'm interested in your thoughts around what's the role of elected officials, not just at the national level, but also locally, in terms of helping to bring the country together, to unify us, when there are some elected officials who are really intent on dividing us.
Sure, I think locally, and it's very important to have these conversations, and I say establish truth commissions at the local level, because elected officials are elected to lead, and young people especially are brilliant. This generation, they know the deal. And so it's important for elected officials to garner everyone, that positive energy, which I call it, because it is, and organize it in a way that the community can benefit from it, and establish commissions, dialogues, healing circles, whatever it takes to begin to have these discussions about telling the truth. So many young people even don't know about the Middle Passage, as an example. So many young people don't know that Africans were enslaved in this country for over 250 years. So many people in our country don't see the relationship between black and brown people dying disproportionately of COVID and the history in this country. And so we have to connect the dots, and I think at the local level, elected officials can certainly take the lead in pulling people together.
Guad, thanks so much for that question. Mr. Teo, I do want to ask you, because I'm a first-generation American. My mom is from Uganda, East Africa. My dad from Ghana. First American in my family, grew up traveling a lot. Right. And it's interesting to me because in America, it seems people are uniquely hesitant to acknowledge the biases that they may hold within themselves. How do we overcome that to really do this work of racial healing?
Well, I think the first thing is acknowledging each other. If we start and recognize that we're all blessings, and we have to sit with each other to understand how you're a blessing to me and how I can be a blessing in your life. You know, as you talk about, our political leaders not ready, hesitant, the children are waiting. They're suffering. They're struggling. They're suffering from the inequity. They're suffering from the trauma of us not, as adults, leading and guiding and really creating schools and creating community centers and creating places in which they can really talk about these things that they're struggling with. And if you don't transform the trauma, it's going to get transferred. It gets transferred among each other, amongst each other. If we don't transform the trauma, it gets transferred. And we see it in communities because now black and brown are struggling. We struggle with each other. We struggle in our homes. And we struggle with ourselves. Mental health issues are going up. They're rising. Anxiety, trauma, suicidal ideations. And the children are facing it. If we don't do it, we're not the solution. The children will have to carry the burden.
Yeah, the work of racial healing is urgent.
Yes. Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Jerry Teo, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Coming up, racial trauma when it comes to policing. We speak with the Chief of Police of Los Angeles and head to one city where law students are seeking solutions.
Plus, with tensions running high on college campuses, what's the line between free speech and hate speech?
For many in in this country, racial trauma is very much connected to the policing of communities of color. In the United States, black people are nearly 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people, according to data collected by the nonprofit mappingpoliceviolence.org.
Guad Venegas recently traveled to Albuquerque, New Mexico for a closer look at a city where people of color make up the majority. Guad?
Kate Sinclair, Albuquerque is a diverse community where the police department has gone through years of reform to reduce the use of force. And although improvements have been made, there's still work to be done. "27-year-old Keyshawn Thomas was asleep in his car when Albuquerque police were called to check on him.
Hey, man. APD.
Minutes later, officers shot Thomas 16 times, according to a filed complaint. You see it on this body cam. Keyshawn told the officers he had a gun in the car.
I do have a weapon in my trunk.
Before they allowed him to walk back and grab his phone.
Grab your phone and come back out.
But police say he picked up a gun.
That's a lie. Keyshawn never pulled his gun out and pointed it at the officers. My son gave the officers his clip that was in his pocket before he re-entered the vehicle.
All right, cool. I'll give it back.
This is what the officer's body cam recorded.
Gun.
He later died.
August 29th was my day. And I thought about all the mothers. Oh my God. This is what it feels like.
After a multi-agency task force investigation, the district attorney's office did not press charges against the officers. The incident is one of 18 police shootings in 2022 involving the Albuquerque Police Department, and according to data compiled by Mapping Police Violence, the department has the 4th highest number of police killings in the country. This, despite the city's police operating under the supervision of the Department of Justice. In 2014, a Department of Justice investigation found that APD officers routinely violated the constitutional rights of residents, unjustly beating them, shocking them with tasers, and even shooting them dead. APD says progress has been made since the Department of Justice entered a consent decree with Albuquerque Police with the goal of reducing unnecessary use of force.
There's a lot that's changed through our settlement agreement. Our review process is very thorough. We have a process where our use of force is reviewed, scrutinized.
But the use of force in communities of color remains a concern.
DOJ is really impressed with the extent to which those numbers have gone down. But here's the thing. Even if they've gone down, when one occurs, there's a 70% chance that the person, the civilian involved, will be a person who is not white, non-Hispanic.
According to police data, at least 11 of the 18 people shot by local police in Albuquerque last year were non-white. Yet at least 70% of the incidents involving use of force by local police in 2022 involved people of color.
Not all of them have the luxury of a program that's going to teach them.
At the University of New Mexico, law school students are teaching high schoolers how to behave when stopped by police. In one class, even bringing in APD officers.
For example, one student said, "Do I have to engage with you if you pull me over?" And the officer gave them the language to use if they did not want to engage in a way that was respectful and also legally acceptable.
Chief Medina agrees racial disparities need attention and says outreach programs are in place.
I think the racial healing starts with communication. Law enforcement and government is really good at listening to the people who are our cheerleaders. The people who support us and like us. We don't like to listen to those that sometimes bring criticisms towards us.
Yet the chief says they are also facing an increase in homicides and gun possession in the city, a challenge to fight crime while placing a vital focus on the use of force and racial disparities. Now, the department has also implemented new training procedures and added mental health resources, among other changes. But those changes are overshadowed by the high number of police shootings taking place. As for the officers involved in the Thomas case, while they were never charged, an internal affairs investigation did find that they failed to de-escalate the situation, they failed to render aid, and they failed to conduct a preliminary investigation. Kate Sinclair.
Guad, thanks so much for that thorough report. We'll see you back in a little bit. Joining us now is Chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, Michael Moore. Chief Moore, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you just saw that report. And it's a story we hear all too often in the United States. So how would you characterize the state of policing in this country and what's needed to rebuild relationships, specifically with communities of color?
Well, I think it's been said is acknowledging our past and recognizing that in policing in America, it's at times been used as an arm of a government to enforce stereotypes, racial injustices, prejudices that existed across as a society. And law enforcement, we see in my experience, I've seen what I call the arc of policing, which is aiming to build trust in our relationships and recognizing that it comes from an area of imperfection. And even today, we still work and struggle and strive each day to do our very best to build relationships that's built on recognizing the individual rights of each individual, the sanctity of life, that the engagement with policing in our communities needs to be done in a manner that's respectful, that's constitutional, and that recognizes, again, our past, and while acknowledging it, also sets a path of optimism for the future.
I remember in 2020, Chief, you were part of a protest after George Floyd's death, and you kneeled. You got a lot of attention. You probably got some blowback for it, too. Why did you do that?
Well, I thought it was important to demonstrate that we're all human, that we're engaged in a relationship from a person to another person. While I wear a uniform of what I feel is one of the greatest departments in the world, it's also a uniform that in past generations has been involved in some of the greatest injustices. And so in the moment of that pain and that anger and frustration, it was important for me not to kneel in the sense of ask for any type of forgiveness, but to just be Michael Moore, a human that represents the department that is striving to do our very best, and kneeling with another individual on the other side of this bike rail that's doing the same thing. They're humanizing themselves.
And Chief Moore, as you're talking about the state of policing, several times you've referenced the history, right? The fact that it's a turbulent one. And some look at that history and have called for what they call, quote, defund the police, right? We heard that especially after the death of George Floyd. What do you make of it, defund the police? Some feel that the system can't be improved.
Well, first of all, I believe that it was the intention of defunding the police was to draw attention to how much policing costs in America and how little America invests in so many other important services, and that you should pull money away from policing and put it into mental health services, put it into the care of supportive services for those that are in greatest need. And I believe as a country, and the greatest country in the world, is that we don't need to defund the police to do that. We need to recognize, though, that policing is not the solution to all the societal problems, and that policing needs to be well-trained, needs to be well-equipped, and needs to be able to handle the challenges before it, while we also, as a country, invest in mental health services, in counseling, in housing, in better jobs, and in a society that these symptoms and these illnesses end up being a policing problem or a policing challenge.
Chief, what does it take to reduce the number of officer-involved shootings in this country, here in Los Angeles, but beyond in the country? And what do you make of the statistics we saw in that piece that disproportionately affected our people of color, particularly Black Americans?
Gun violence in America should be a national shame. We kill far too many of ourselves in this country at a far higher rate than most other countries in the world, free countries particularly. The ever-presence of guns in the hands of all types of individuals is a problem that then policing is brought into, where in this country officers die by the hundreds each year at the hands of other individuals. And so the vast majority of interactions between policing or police officers and the public go without the use of force, any type of force. In Los Angeles, we'll have more than 1 million to 1.5 million encounters in a year. And the vast majority of them will not result in any type of force. However, last year, we resorted to 31 instances of using deadly force. Now, all of them weren't in policy, there's actions taken for those that broke policy. But the perfect number of officer-involved shootings in Los Angeles is 0. But to achieve
how do you get there?
How do we achieve? Well, I think that our efforts as a country is to ensure that people have mental health services, people have options, people have jobs, people are part of society, and that they don't resort to criminality or preying upon others and resorting to gun violence. And so it's a long road in front of us. For LAPD, for our work, much like other major law enforcement agencies, it's also recognizing that our responsibility to find manners of de-escalation, to find tools and tactics that recognize the reverence for human life, that the use of deadly force is an absolute last resort, and that when we do resort to that it's going to be fairly investigated and reported, transparency to the public, so that they can see through body-worn videos and others what was the officer confronted with and what was the officer's actions reasonable. Because this country, we also see officers that are killed in the line of duty at the hands of assailants. And this is a social contract that, we want officer-involved shootings to be zero. We want officers killed in the line of duty to be zero as well.
Chief Moore, LAPD Chief of Police, very good to have you with us. Michael Moore, thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, with tensions high on college campuses, we'll take you to one school where students are opening up a dialogue.
And we'll tell you how one group in the South is breaking down barriers by fighting poverty.
Welcome back. Before you can have healing or even reconciliation, you need a relationship, and often that starts with a conversation. But how do you navigate a conversation about race? Well, that can be tricky and sensitive. So we spoke with a racial healing facilitator from the Little Black Pearl organization, who told us racial healing starts with listening intently, agreeing not to judge, and trying to see your story in others.
With that in mind, NBC's Shaquille Brewster traveled to the University of Michigan for an eye-opening discussion with 5 students working to bridge divides on issues from race to religion and ethnicity.
From segregation
James Hood is the first of his race to become a University of Alabama student.
to the war in Vietnam to more recently the Israel-Hamas war.
Columbia, you will see.
College campuses have long been flashpoints for free speech. I had dinner with a group of 5 University of Michigan students from various backgrounds to learn about the atmosphere on campus and their work to overcome divisions.
If there was a word to describe the mood that you have, the feeling that you have being on campus right now, what would that word be?
Anxious. Difficult. We're at a time where everyone, I think, needs to take a deep breath, calm down, try to diffuse the situation, at least on campuses, and begin to facilitate dialogues, because universities are supposed to be places of discussion and debate and free speech, and they're not these days.
I would say imbalance for me. There's a certain palatable blackness that is accepted by society, and when you don't fit into that, it's very easy to be neglected, pushed to the side. I've learned how to deal with it and build community to support me through it.
Exhausted yet hopeful. Being Native American, we are fighting for different things on campus, like our powwow every year has been off campus for a couple of years now, but we're trying to get that back on campus. You're hoping once your 4 years are up, you set it up better for the people who are coming in, and you hope to give them like a roadmap on how to make it even better for the next generations.
It's been a combination of anxiety and both determination.
Raise your hand if you have felt on campus a concern about your words or your feelings being misconstrued. Everyone.
I feel like every day you have to watch your words on whatever you do. You can be labeled something if you just misspeak once.
Does this feel new, or has it always been this way for you?
It's not really new. I would say it kind of really started election season when I first was a freshman. Me and my roommate had differing opinions on political candidates, and sometimes I'd hear him say stuff and I'd say stuff, and we'd both look at each other and be like, what do you really think? Like, you just kind of learn, oh, I should just watch what I speak. I can think what I want, but if I say something, I don't want to get in an argument.
A lot of times when we are advocating Palestinian liberation in particular, it's misconstrued as us like stating that we want to like completely eradicate like the Jewish population, and I'm like, no, like our safety comes with the safety of the Jewish population hand in hand.
I'm just curious, just because like not every day I get to speak to like a Palestinian student. So like when we talk about liberation, like what Palestinian liberation means to you in conjunction with Jewish safety. Because I love how you said that, and I think we don't want you not being in the land either, but how are you going to retain some type of like democratic just state in, you know, in the area that's in your necklace that I call Israel and you might call Palestine.
For a liberated Palestine, I think that means going beyond the system that is currently embedded within Israel and that is currently embedded within Hamas. And I think it means establishing a state that initially is going back to what Palestinians call Palestine, while also allowing all ethnicities, religions, and people to live in there with the same rules, same laws. It applies to everyone.
You both used anxiety at the beginning of this conversation. What's the feeling that you get knowing that there's someone else who feels that same level of anxiety as you?
Just knowing that we do come from like the same shared values of like love and respect and empathy and humanity. It's assuring and it's also disheartening, but I do think it makes me feel better that I know even on different sides of the same issue, there is a lot of commonplace.
I think that is a great way for us to start, a conversation like that, shared grief, the shared fear of what the future holds. And I do hope that that is what paves the path for people to have these conversations with other individuals.
We need to be more intentional about the way we engage across identity groups in particular, because as a Black student, seeing another identity or seeing other identities who I've shared histories or certain struggles with at some point, I relate to the feeling. I empathize with the feeling.
Conversations like these make me more optimistic about what college campuses could be and what the future could hold for not just our democracy but democracies across the globe, in that you can have people from different identities and different backgrounds to come to the table, break bread, and just talk from a place of mutual respect.
Hello.
Thank you, Shaq, for guiding that important conversation. For more on navigating tough conversations, let's bring in psychologist and racial trauma expert Dr. Jenny Wang, who also wrote Permission to Come Home, Reclaiming Mental Health as Asian Americans.
We're also joined by leadership expert and the chair of Cherokees of Los Angeles, an affiliate of Cherokee Nation, Professor Cynthia Ruiz. Thank you both so much for joining us. So I think in this conversation, we kind of want to provide a toolkit for people, right, on having these conversations. So Dr. Wang, I want to start with you because we just heard from those students, and so many of them said, I'm afraid people are going to misinterpret what I say. I'm afraid to speak. Can you talk to us about how that kind of fear can be difficult, challenging when we're in these racial healing spaces, when we're trying to come together and talk?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I think we're all really longing for is psychological safety, right? When we have these conversations, they're going to bring up past traumas, intergenerational traumas and stories. They're going to bring up a lot of pain and struggle. And in that, if there's not a safe space in which people can be held in that, to be understood and seen, then people end up reacting against each other in that moment. And so I think to have those conversations, we need to, one, have humility. But that comes from setting aside perhaps our ego in the moment, owning the fact that we have our own pain and that we are working through that actively, to then behold the suffering of another. And I would say the second ingredient then would be, can we hold reverence for the sacredness of another human being, irrespective of what divides us, but that I care about you and your sanctity of being here as much as I would myself or the people I love.
Professor Ruiz, can I be really honest? I'm a white woman from upstate New York, from a predominantly white town. My family dates back generations to a ship right after the Mayflower, the Snow family in this country. And sometimes it makes me scared that I might say the wrong thing if I enter a conversation like this, quite frankly. Like, I get scared about what do I say and how do I own everything that I just said. I realize the privileges that I've had. What's your suggestion for people like me who might be a little scared to, as you said, say the wrong thing?
Well, I think first and foremost is honesty. We heard earlier tonight about the truth. We really just want the truth, and especially for Native people in this country, we want the truth to be told, told about our history. You know, from our perspective, you know, Columbus didn't just come and discover America. We were already here. We were here and we were thriving. In North America, there were civilizations, advanced civilizations throughout, you know, all the way down to the Mayans and the Aztecs in central, what we know now as the United States. Chaco Canyon was a hub. That's in New Mexico. It was a hub of thought leaders coming together. So part of it is just for us, what we want is an acknowledgement of the origins of this country. First and foremost, I just want to say thank you for having this conversation, this very important conversation, because this is part of the healing. And for us, having that acknowledgement and having these safe spaces, I think it's important when we have these safe spaces to have ground rules, especially at the university level. You know, ground rules where people are, you know, having respect for each other. People want to be heard. And, you know, when we really have a safe space to be heard, the healing can begin. Because, as Dr. Wang mentioned, this is, you know, generational trauma. This is historical trauma. And for Native people, we have gone through nothing less than genocide in this country. And it hasn't been acknowledged, so it's hard for us to heal.
Well, it strikes me that the reality is so many of these conversations in this country don't happen in healing circles, right? They get heated. So what do you recommend, A, for de-escalating, but B, also moving forward? Because sometimes things get heated. Someone says something that triggers someone else. How do you move in that?
Yeah, I would say that in those moments, I think, you know, if you have the wherewithal to realize you're triggered, can you even call for a timeout in that moment and say, hey, hold on, I'm feeling something, right? And even naming that discomfort, naming perhaps the anger, the rage that might have surfaced from it, and saying, you know what, this conversation is important enough that I'm not going to rush forward in this. And there's no urgency, right? This work is lifelong for all of us. So let me actually take a minute, or let me take a few minutes, and let's circle back when I'm in a better place to show up well, and that this conversation actually can lead us forward.
That's so good. Racial trauma took time, and racial healing takes time too, as do these conversations. Well, Dr. Jenny Wang and Professor Cynthia Ruiz, thank you both for your time. We really appreciate it.
Up next, inequality is a huge barrier to racial healing, but one group in Kentucky working specifically with white residents to focus on shared goals to try and lift a whole community out of poverty.
People shouldn't have to struggle that hard. If we all come together, maybe we could start to change things.
Welcome back. Racial healing can take a lot of different forms, but one thing is certain: to heal, well, that requires everyone.
And that includes white Americans. NBC's Antonia Hilton traveled to Kentucky to see how one group is partnering across communities to improve living conditions.
Nestled on the eastern Kentucky border between Ohio and West Virginia sits Ashland, a town of more than 21,000, where a quarter of residents live in poverty, some in dire and dangerous conditions.
The ceiling is it's in bad shape.
NBC News was allowed inside this Ashland apartment, where tenants say the landlord has all but abandoned them.
I have nowhere else to go.
How does that make you feel? You're paying hundreds of dollars a month to live here?
It don't make me feel good.
Everybody say KPU!
The Kentucky People's Union, in conjunction with Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURJ, is working to bring together people like Jerry and others to rally around a shared goal of guaranteed safe and affordable housing for everyone. Kentucky native Beth Howard is a lead SURJ organizer and co-founder of KPU. She believes highlighting common interests like housing can be a first step toward racial healing.
Is your concern that if you don't reach these folks, someone else will?
Absolutely. We know if people are not talking to white people about their suffering, we know someone else is. And that someone else is the far right. They know that there are so many of us, working class people, white, black, and brown, that if we came together, we would outnumber them.
Kathy Johnson was among Beth's first recruits.
It has really opened up my eyes, and I'm proud to say that I have friends that are different than me.
Why do you think this work is rare?
Because it doesn't serve those who empowered to have white people, first of all, recognizing whiteness and having us talk to other white people about racism.
Okay. Volunteers wear red bandanas and call themselves rednecks in what organizers say is a nod to the history of the region's working class, a 1921 labor uprising in which white, black, and immigrant coal miners joined together to fight for better wages and working conditions.
The miners wore red bandanas around their necks to signify to each other they were union.
So you use the term redneck.
Yes.
Some people see that as a pejorative or disrespectful term. What does it mean to you?
That label has now been, distorted to mean racist, right? Or trash. Our history that show this different story, that show this different way of being a white person is hidden. Those truths are dangerous to those in power.
Antonia, thanks so much for that. Well, joining us now is Tim Wise, anti-racism activist and author of Dispatches from the Race War, as well as White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son.
He's joined by Professor Irshad Manji, founder and CEO of Moral Courage, which teaches people to turn contentious issues into constructive conversations. She also wrote Don't Label Me, How to Do Diversity Without Inflaming the Culture Wars. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here. Professor Manji, let me start with you. We just heard that piece, and they talked about the showing up for racial justice folks talked about a word that makes people cringe sometimes. I wonder about language. And I think people think a lot when we're having conversations about healing, what language to use and what's off limits. How do you address that?
Language is how we communicate, along with, of course, our bodies and our facial expressions. And so if we're afraid about being called out for any language that we may be, using, state your fear up front. Be human. Allow yourself to be vulnerable, because you're choosing vulnerability rather than being trapped into it. And so when you choose it, you're actually showing that you've got enough self-assurance, enough strength to know that sometimes you are going to be wrong. And when you own that humility, and that's a word we've heard earlier tonight, then you're also giving the person on the other side of the conversation the permission to be humble as well. That's a pretty good start.
Absolutely. And Professor Manji, as you're talking about language, I'm reminded of words that come up a lot when we talk about racism. So, Tim, I want to bring you in, because we often hear white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility. How should we think about whiteness when we're in these spaces?
Well, I think we should think about it the way that the Surge folks are asking us to, right? Which is understanding that whiteness is something that was done to so-called white people. It's not inherent. It's not, as you said earlier, a biological or racial thing. It's a social thing, and it was created for a very specific reason. And the reason, going back to the colonies, was to divide working class, often very poor people who realized they had far more in common with one another than they did with the elite, right? The landowners in Virginia that owned all the land, they didn't like black folks. They didn't like poor white people either. And so at that time, you had working class whites and enslaved Africans, the white folks, indentured servants in many cases, Africans enslaved, who came together to attempt to overthrow aristocratic arrangements in places like Virginia. So what did they do? They created the idea of the white race. Why? To take these poor people and say, well, you're on the team. You're on our team. You're wearing our uniform. Now, you still don't own any land, and we don't like you. And we're going to keep you poor, and we're going to keep you landless, but at least you're better than those black folks, right? We're going to give you just enough of an advantage to believe yourself superior psychologically. W.E.B. Du Bois called it the psychological wage of whiteness. And what it did was keep working class folks from realizing that oftentimes the people with the wealth, The people with the money don't love any of us, right? And so if black life doesn't matter, if brown life doesn't matter, ultimately white life will not. And that's what white supremacy has done. It's divided us from people of color, which is why what Surge is doing is so important in places like Kentucky, West Virginia, East Tennessee, etc.
Tim, can I say something that I'm not proud of?
Sure.
As a white person, I have been somewhere and heard another white person say something awful, something racist. I think of a time when I was with my young kids in a crowd and I heard a man say something completely reprehensible, but I was scared that if I said something and spoke up in that moment, I was with my kids by myself. So I didn't say anything, and I still think about it.
Yeah.
How do we confront that if we hear people saying something that we fundamentally disagree with and want to try to say something?
Well, first off, we've all had those moments, right, of individually dropping the ball, whether it's about this or a sexist comment or an Islamophobic comment, anti-Semitic comment or whatever. So, number one, you have to be willing to forgive yourself because, in a sense, we are trained to not speak out in the face of injustice. That is acculturated. That is something we're taught. So, number one, forgive yourself. Number two, remember there will be another opportunity, unfortunately, right, to do better. And all of this takes practice. What's really critical, and I don't want to miss the opportunity to say this, is rather than focusing on the individual failures, whether it is that person you saw or your own failure, keep in mind that racism is a systemic problem. It isn't a problem of yours and that man or these people who are around us right now in the audience. I mean, it is our problem, but it is systematized. We are going to have plenty of opportunities at the institutional level, in the workplace, in housing, in the justice system, in schools, to take a stand. And I would rather us do that than beat ourselves up over the times that we either said something insensitive or failed to challenge someone who did. As important as that is, it's a systemic problem, and we have to address it systemically.
And Tim is right, it takes practice. It's not one and done. So let's keep giving ourselves the grace and seek out the opportunities to do better.
Tim Wise, Professor Manji, thank you both so much. Really appreciate it. Let's go back to NBC News correspondent Guad Venegas, who's been with us. He's been talking to the audience. Guad.
Kate Sinclair, so we have a wall in the studio where we ask the audience to write down what racial healing means to them. Two members of the audience are going to come up and talk about this into the microphone. First, we're joined by Shane Murphy-Goldsmith, President and CEO of Liberty Hill. This is a social change foundation based here in Los Angeles. Shane, what does racial healing mean to you?
Well, at Liberty Hill Foundation, we believe that you can't have racial healing without racial justice. And the bad news is that racial injustice is powerful in Los Angeles. I don't know if you know, but we lock up more kids in jail than anywhere in the country. We have more folks living on the street than anywhere in the country. And Los Angeles is the nation's largest urban oil field, which is poisoning residents all over LA. The good news is that those very same folks, the black and brown folks who are being jailed, the black folks and other people of color who are unhoused, they're the same ones fighting back and organizing around real solutions in LA. So with Liberty Hill support, they've closed half the youth jails, they've banned urban oil drilling here in Los Angeles, and we're fighting for a roof over every head. So the good news is that there are solutions, and folks right here in Los Angeles are winning solutions every day, and we can all be part of that.
Thank you, Shane. And up next, we have another member of the audience, Stephanie Roman with Hispanics in Philanthropy. What does it mean to you?
Well, racial healing is complicated. It's messy, but you could do it individually or collectively. And for me and for us at Hispanics in Philanthropy, that means unlearning a lot of the dominant social constructs that we've been brought up in, which includes sense of urgency, perfectionism, idealism, all these things, and relearning and reconnecting back with our ancestors, our language, our foods, our medicine. That's what racial healing means to us.
Thank you. And it's important to keep in mind, depending on who we are and what experiences we've had in life, racial healing can mean different things for each one of us. Kate Sinclair.
Guad Venegas, thank you so much, and thank you both for sharing. We really appreciate it.
When I hear the word race, I think the skin color or culture of an individual.
I also heard the word racist. That's how I learned about the word race.
Not necessarily identity, but I think of where you come from.
When I learned about race, I was about in the 3rd grade. They were teaching us about black people and their history.
I feel like people should get treated equally, even if they have different color or different race. Everybody should get treated equally.
They just have a different color on the skin, but it doesn't really mean anything.
People are people, humans are humans,
And yeah, we don't have to be mean to one another.
Out of the mouth of babes, huh?
That's right.
Those are middle school students in the Los Angeles area offering their thoughts on racial healing. We hope that you have been inspired and motivated by the stories and conversations you've heard so far.
I know I have. The bigger question is, what can you do now to forward racial healing within yourself and your community? And joining us now is Lin Montgomery Tabon. She's the president and CEO of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Lin, we're so glad to have you with us. You've said before that racial equity requires racial healing. Tell me what you mean by that.
Absolutely. Racial equity is getting to a place where every person has an opportunity regardless of the color of their skin. We've heard the history that this country has gone through. And so healing is at the heart of how we get to that transformation. Healing is about connecting people, allowing people to build trust with one another, to get back to our common humanity. And then together we can create opportunities and systems that work for everyone.
Lin, 3 things. I mean, there's so much people can do, but what are 3 things individuals can do to further racial healing, to embrace it?
Absolutely. I think we've seen it in this session. First, you can do your own work. We all have pain. We all have trauma related to racism and structural racism. So the first is to feel good about your own journey. Tell your story. And that is about affirmation. The second thing that you can do is do the work of learning the history and our truths. Someone earlier said truths are dangerous to certain people. Truths are not dangerous to healing. And then finally, you have to have the conversation. You have to have the dialogue. You have to be brave and courageous and connect and have the difficult conversation.
Building courage, that's what these conversations require. And Lin, thank you for joining us in this conversation and for hosting it and your leadership. We also should note that the W.K. Kellogg Foundation is the sponsor of this special. And thank you to NBC News correspondent Guad Venegas for your contributions, as well as all of you in our audience for being so very present. That's what these conversations require, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to get cynical, right, in a country dominated by incidents of racial trauma and violence. So I want to end by saying, if you're someone actively working in these racial healing spaces, remember to do the inner work of healing too. If you're new to these conversations, welcome. As Lin said, stay brave. Know that sometimes you'll get it wrong. That doesn't mean you should stop trying. And remember, we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. So keep listening in these conversations.
I like that. Zincle, I learned so much preparing for this special with you, hosting this special. My biggest takeaway, I think, is that racial healing does not happen if just one group of people talk about it together. It's going to take all of us. And when I travel the country and when I report or I go cover natural disasters, I know you found this too, that I often see the kindness of strangers and the common humanity that we share. We are so much more alike than we are different, and I think we can make progress, and you're all a part of that out there. So we want to thank all of our correspondents who you saw tonight, the guests who contributed to such an important discussion, to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation again for sponsoring. I'm Kate Snow.
I'm Zincle Esamoah. Of course, we'll continue to bring you stories and dialogues like this on NBC News Now, which you can watch 24/7 wherever you stream. From all of us here at NBC News, stay safe and stay well. Thanks for watching.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.